Hello and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about the surge in journalists getting beat up, kidnapped, jailed, and worse.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, president of the National Press Foundation. For journalists working abroad, beatings, kidnappings, threats, and killings are all too real. Today we're talking about how to cope in a hostile environment, as well as strategies for mitigating risk and protecting your sources. With me in the studio today are Tom Kent, president of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and Alex Ellerbeck, senior research associate at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
So, threats, beatings, killings, these are everyday challenges if you're a journalist working overseas. Let's start with Alex, who can give us an update on the Committee to Protect Journalists statistics on these terrible things.
Thanks. This is a very dangerous time to be a journalist. As you mentioned, we see rising authoritarianism, we see the proliferation of violent non-state actors, and we see declining rule of law. There are 40 active conflicts around the world, 65 million displaced people, and so journalists reporting in these environments face incredible risks. Since the Committee to Protect Journalists, we're an international nonprofit press freedom organization. Since we began keeping statistics on journalist killings in 1992, we've seen 1,243 journalists killed in direct relation to their work as a journalist. We have another 489 cases of journalists who have been killed in circumstances where we've not yet confirmed the motive, but where there's high suspicion that it might be related to their work. 9 out of 10 journalists killed, according to CPJ, are local journalists. So while foreign correspondents face significant risks, and I think we'll be talking more about that and ways that they might mitigate those risks, it's important to remember that local reporters still face the brunt of this violence. Last year, we saw 48 journalists killed in direct retaliation for their work, another 29 cases of journalists killed where we're still investigating the motive. This is actually somewhat lower than numbers we've seen before. In 2015, we saw 72 journalists killed for their work, and we're not sure what goes into that. I think it's a mixture of self-censorship. Fewer journalists are being deployed to some of the most dangerous parts of the world, and other forms of censorship or silencing journalists are also proliferating. But suffice it to say, it's still an incredibly dangerous time. We still see large numbers of journalists being killed in conflicts in the Middle East, as well as in countries like Mexico and the Philippines, where criminal organizations and drug trafficking, combined with an atmosphere of impunity, have created a very violent situation and dangerous situation for reporters. This year has been incredibly difficult in Mexico. We've seen 4 journalists killed for their work. Another journalist is missing. We're investigating the circumstances behind the killing of another journalist. So, sort of 6 journalists killed or missing in just this year is heartbreaking and staggering. The other thing that we've seen is an increased number of journalists imprisoned. Mm-hmm. We've seen 259 journalists were in jail on December 1st last year. That's the highest number that CPJ has ever recorded.
That's across the world, right?
That's across the world. So CPJ does an annual tally on December 1st of every year. This number does not capture journalists imprisoned during the year and then released before December 1st. So it's important to remember that that number is actually much lower than the total number of journalists imprisoned over the course of the past year. But 259 journalists, that number is staggering, and a lot of that has to do with Turkey. Mm-hmm. After the failed coup attempt against Erdogan in July 2016, we saw a press freedom situation that was already incredibly bad and had already caused CPJ to start creating a daily Turkey Chronicle, a daily blog to track press freedom violations in Turkey. We saw this already terrible situation get infinitely worse. Over 100 media outlets shut down, over 100 journalists were arrested. We recorded 81 journalists in prison on December 1st. That number is lower than some other groups, in part because there were some cases where we weren't able to confirm the motive behind why somebody might be in prison. Court documents were frequently sealed, and frequently lawyers or journalists weren't able to talk to the press. But it's hard to overstate how bad the situation has been in Turkey. And we also see journalists jailed in China and Egypt, the other two leading jailers of journalists. We've seen increasingly that journalists are caught in something we call the terror dynamic. Not only are they facing increased threats from non-state actors, they're frequently targeted for kidnapping or killing by terrorists, but terrorism has also caused states to use it as a justification to lock up journalists. 189 journalists have been charged under anti-state charges. Many of those are under charges related to terrorism around the world.
Mm-hmm. Let's hear from Tom, who many of those journalists, or some of those journalists that you depict on that map of being in jail, work for him. So, Tom, tell us a little bit more about Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
Indeed. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is based in Prague. We operate in 26 languages to 23 countries on a wide variety of platforms, radio, television, mobile apps, internet, and so forth. We are subsidized by Congress. Congress pays our expenses, but by law we have an independent editorial policy. We have 17 bureaus out across our geographies, which are basically the Balkans, all of the former Soviet Union, and Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And some of those
are some hotbeds.
Some of those are pretty tough neighborhoods for journalists, and we've had our problems there. I think we have a little bit of video from one of our correspondents, Sergei Khazov-Kassia, who was, along with his cameraman, Andrei Kostyanov, beaten up on March 28th in Krasnodar in Russia as they were preparing to film a farmers' protest. And in this video, Sergei Khazov-Kassia talks about what happened.
Вышли с утра с оператором Андреем Костяновым из гостиницы, и прямо на стоянке возле гостиницы нас напало человек 10-15 молодчиков в масках, в балаклавах, начали избивать ногами, повалили на землю.
Alex showed a list of journalists in prison by country, and on that list under Turkmenistan was a correspondent of ours, Sapar Mehmed Nepeskuliyev. He's a contributor to RFE-RL's Turkmen service. He's been in jail for about 3 years now. Another contributor of ours in Turkmenistan, Sultan Achilova, she's 67 years old and has been beaten up twice and run over by a bicycle once for her work by people we see as representing the authorities. We have another contributor in Crimea, Mykola Simyana, who has been charged by the authorities in Crimea, the Russian-controlled authorities in Crimea, with trying to undermine the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. He's on trial now. Beyond that, we have members of our Iran and Uzbek services who work outside Iran and Uzbekistan, but their relatives inside those countries have been threatened, arrested, and so forth. There are several countries like Iran and Azerbaijan and also the ISPs in Crimea that have been trying to block us on the web. Iran jams our radio. So it's a varied landscape and one that concerns us a lot.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, you're a journalist who's been behind bars for 3 years. What can you do for him?
Well, we do intervene in these cases to the extent we can. A number of free press organizations have spoken up in support of our people in a lot of places. So far, it hasn't turned the key for Nepeskaliyev, but in many other situations it has. It's surprising a little bit that some regimes, even who you think might be impervious to outside criticism, do pay attention. They do have some concern for their international image. And when there's concerted publicity from governments, from international human rights organizations, from countries that those nations want to have decent relationships with, want to get aid from, that can sometimes have an effect.
Mm-hmm. And I guess CPJ does the same thing. The publicity mm-hmm. can help.
Yeah, certainly. And we've seen, there are some countries that seem to be impervious to that pressure. 2/3 of journalists are jailed in only five countries. So there are some countries where that's much harder, but we've certainly seen that pressure work all over the world. In Cuba, for example, there was a period when you'd routinely have 29 or 30 journalists in jail every year, and we've seen that number decrease dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Why is the international reporting scene so tough right now? I mean, I know, Alex, you said it's the local reporting, but what is it about the dynamic that makes it so tough right now?
Well, I think one thing is the end of the Cold War. During that period, for better or for worse, the United States and the Soviet Union were sworn enemies, but the various movements they controlled around the world all sort of accepted journalists as having the right to exist. Now, no one's really in charge. Large parts of the world are controlled by various kinds of rebel groups, criminal groups, for whom these journalists don't provide any service. It used to be that even guerrillas and all sorts of non-state actors wanted journalists to tell their story. Mm-hmm. Now they don't need journalists to tell their stories. They have their own websites. They have their own videos. So in their minds, journalists are potential witnesses in a war crime trial. They're potential spies. They just don't see any value to them, and so they play for keeps, and they don't value journalists' lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Alex?
I think that's exactly right. I think, we've talked to reporters who covered conflicts in the Balkans or Nicaragua who tell stories of being able to cross between sides and talk to both sides of the conflict. Here, now I think that's increasingly rare and increasingly dangerous. Journalists are much more valuable now as hostages or as a way to send a message to another government than they are as a means to get the message out, or sort of in a neutral body that's respected as such.
Mm-hmm. How do you define reasonable risk in these environments?
Well, that's really a question for every journalist. Some journalists want to be in the middle of the story. If a building is being bombed, if artillery is striking buildings, they want to be in the cellar with the victims. Others think that that's too much risk. They would rather try to divine which side is winning in a conflict and stay closer to that side for their own safety. These are decisions for individuals, but if you're going to take that kind of a risk to really put your life in jeopardy, then you need to think about what happens if things really go south. Are you going to wind up forcing someone else, like an embassy or military or police or something, to come rescue you and put their lives at risk because of a decision that you made?
Is that a reasonable assessment for your situation? Will others have to come to my rescue?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Some journalists feel that a story is worth their own life. So be it. But they shouldn't at the last moment decide, oh, actually, no, I need to be rescued now at someone else's expense.
Mm-hmm. And do you train your journalists on reasonable risk as well as personal safety and other tactics?
Well, yeah, most news organizations, including ours, do various kinds of dangerous situation training. One aspect that's sometimes forgotten, though, as people train in first aid and how to evade surveillance and so forth. One aspect that's sometimes forgotten is preparing yourself for ethical choices you might have to make. For example, if you're at a scene of a battle and you find a wounded soldier, are you going to help that soldier out of humane considerations, or are you going to say, no, that would be helping one side, it's not my job to intervene to help one side soldiers, I'm just going to step aside and ignore that soldier? Or if you're covering a famine, are you able to go take your pictures, do your work, and leave? Or are you going to feel, no, I've got to stay all night and help distribute food to victims? These are, you could argue either side of those cases, but it's good to think about these things in advance.
So dangers in war and civil unrest, what kinds of equipment should journalists have with them? And what kind of training should they have?
I think it's very important to have training if you're going into a conflict zone.
I know we've got a slide on this. Yeah.
And how to deal with those conflicts. I think it's also important, you brought up some of the issues around ethical training. I think it's important to integrate into that mental health training and mental health resources. I think that's something that's frequently overlooked. In terms of equipment, helmets, body armor, I think you need to evaluate the circumstance. So in certain criminal settings, or in certain settings where you're covering crime, maybe body armor is more likely to distinguish you and make you look like law enforcement. And so in that case, you might not use it. But certainly if you're embedding with military groups, or if you're in a situation of armed conflict or protest that might turn violent, having body armor is important. Sometimes bringing tear gas masks, being prepared for the use of tear gas, being prepared to evacuate the situation, always wearing clothing that is comfortable and lets you move easily. I think going in with a plan and going in knowing what sort of security issues may arise, with strong contacts on the ground, with strong contacts with your editors, with a strong plan in case your first line of communication fails is extremely important.
To Alex's point about body armor, I'd say that sometimes you can be killed for your body armor. I mean, that is something that's valuable. So you come in with a $3,000 flak jacket and or a $350 stab vest and all these other things. There are people who want that kind of stuff. So you're putting yourself at some risk. Also, people tend to have an inflated idea of what a bulletproof vest is. Nothing's really bulletproof if it's shot at from close range. So people can feel a little more invulnerable than they are. And there's also the problem that if you're talking to distressed populations and victims and traumatized people, as you often are, if you descend on them full of body armor looking like Darth Vader, it scares people and makes them wonder, are you really a journalist? Or as Alex pointed out, are you police? Are you military? So this kind of equipment has its downside too.
Do your journalists, Tom, have like a standard sort of operating pack? Things that they have to have with them at all times?
It varies tremendously by location, and it's something that's best decided by journalists and their supervisors from country to country. Every culture, every conflict is different. The most important thing is to have people on the ground who really know the situation. Most of our correspondents are local people who know the situation that they're operating in. And if you unfortunately wind up being parachuted into a country or a situation where you don't know anything about what's going on, you really do need to acquire some local advice before you go out there and assume this is just like the last conflict you covered 3 countries away.
And local advice would be?
Local advice on how to behave.
From whom, though?
From local correspondents. They're usually the best source.
And what about the training, hostile environment training? Is that something that you recommend for your journalists, or that CPJ recommends in general?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we recommend that journalists have access to, and it's something many freelance journalists don't have access to, but there's increasingly organizations that help provide funds for freelancers to take those training courses as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's really valuable. Some things you learn are really essential, like first aid, how to behave if you're seized, and then a lot of things that you never would have thought of. You can learn from a course like this. People learn that if you're in an enclosed area where a grenade goes off, one of the things you need to do, in addition to hitting the floor, is to open your mouth, because the shock waves will be dissipated that way, and you'll have fewer internal injuries. Mm-hmm. Or they tell you that just before someone hits you, they tend to almost instinctively raise their chin a little bit. So there's a little bit of a warning. I mean, who would know? But that's the kind of thing you learn from some of these courses.
Mm-hmm. And how expensive are they typically? I think they're like 5-day courses, or maybe it runs the gamut.
It runs the gamut. I think that they can be expensive, but there are NGOs that will help freelance journalists with this.
Mm-hmm. And what about local journalists, Alex? We were talking about them being sort of the 9 out of 10 who are most in danger. Do they really have access to this kind of training, or are there organizations that at least make available resources online for them to perhaps watch videos?
I think there's some information available online. CPJ has a pretty extensive security guide online. Organizations like Rory Peck Trust work with freelancers.
What was that one again?
Rory Peck Trust work with freelancers, including local freelancers, to help provide access to resources like this. But I mean, the disparity is still enormous. Generally speaking, local journalists have much more limited access to these trainings. And there often tends to be a mindset where it's overlooked that they, both in terms of security training, in terms of mental health resources, it can often be overlooked that local journalists are bearing the brunt of these risks, they're bearing the brunt of the violence, and they're bearing the sort of day in and day out sort of psychological harm. So, I think that's an area where it's very important to expand resources as well.
And what should a journalist do if they find themselves in a potentially dangerous situation? Is there a version of, stop, drop, and roll, run?
Well, it depends on the situation. If you're going off to an interview with somebody who is kind of a shady character and you're worried about it, you should definitely case that place in advance. You should know what the exit opportunities are. If you're meeting in a restaurant, know where the back door is. Go with somebody who can keep an eye outside to protect you. If you're traveling along a road that's not safe, a lot of journalists in those situations will keep a text message on the screen of their phone, and every few minutes will update it. Now at kilometer 35, now at kilometer 45. So something happens, they can just hit the send button and people know where they last were. So, all dangers are different, but sometimes thinking ahead can help.
This might be a good time to look at that video from about the NPR journalists who were killed, and it turns out that they were targeted and followed and assassinated.
Like on any other reporting assignment in the field, I had the recorder going and my headphones on, so the sound is enhanced. I can hear the bullets striking the vehicle. I get really scared. I touch Tom on the shoulder. He sits right in front of me. He turns around and says,
"Everything's going to be okay." And I really meant it. We've been shot at with mortars on previous trips, and this is going to sound nuts, but this really didn't sound all that dangerous. I could not see anything landing.
But this is my first gun battle. I'm horrified.
So that was definitely a case of, journalists choosing to go to Helmand province in Afghanistan to cover a story and, winding up in a bad situation, even though they were with what they thought were friendly forces. So embedding with the military isn't necessarily the answer either.
No, there are no guarantees. As a matter of fact, one thing that journalists can can ask himself or herself is, do I really want to be doing this? People just sort of assume that if you're a journalist, you need to be a war correspondent, or that this is the ultimate form of journalism. And for a lot of people, it's the wrong choice. I would think that it's a very sane decision for many people not to engage in this. It's very specialized work. It's very traumatic work. And there are a lot of things you can do in journalism and win prizes and be famous without doing this. So people have to really ask, can I really handle this? Do I want to? It's a big decision that a lot of people just take too lightly.
Now, Tom, you yourself were an international correspondent for many years for the Associated Press. How do you think the world has changed from your time covering various conflicts in USSR and Iran to now, when you're advising a large number of journalists around the world?
Well, I think one of the biggest changes due to social networks, phones, internet, and all that, is that the reporting that you do now goes immediately back to the people who you're reporting on. It used to be, you sent something off, got published in a newspaper back in your country, and no one was ever the wiser. Now people are reading in real time what you're writing, and that can have a strong effect on people and can bring retaliation, can bring threats. So it's changed the dynamic a lot. There's no such thing anymore as a foreign correspondent, even if you're a foreigner. You are a local correspondent and being judged in the local context and facing all the dangers that exist in that country.
That's an interesting thing that you just mentioned. So do you advise your reporters to stay off social media if they're in the heat of a story, a hostile environment, or do they need to report the story no matter what the medium?
You have to report the story, but we certainly expect that our reporters will be objective in their coverage. I mean, that's our mission, that's our job, that's our expectation. So if people are on social networks and in their own reporting, they need to try to be objective. Now, that doesn't mean that various aggressive forces will be pleased with an objective story. I mean, they would rather it be totally one-sided to their side. But from the standpoint of journalistic integrity and safety to some degree, there's nothing that can replace an effort to report fairly.
And a journalist who suddenly finds himself in an unruly crowd or a hostile crowd, what advice do you have for them? What should they do?
Well, the first thing to know is that crowds change quickly. You may be talking to a crowd who is telling you about how they've suffered and telling you their stories, and you're writing it down, and it seems to be very copacetic. They're telling you what happened. You're going to tell the world. That's great. And then you say, well, my deadline is coming. I got to run. Thanks a lot. And they say, well, wait a minute. We're not through. We have more to tell you. And no, really, I've got to go. No, you need to stay. Things can change very quickly. So I think that you always have to be thinking in certain kinds of situations about how am I going to get out of here? How can I be polite and respect local customs to the degree necessary so as not to offend people, but still be able to carry out my work? It's very tricky, and there again, local knowledge is important. What works with a crowd in country A may not work on a crowd in country B.
When journalists are seized, whether it's in a crowd situation or just in a hostile environment, is there any particular pattern that you see at CPJ when, are they covering any particular kind of story or any pattern to who seizes them?
Well, if we're talking about kidnappings, I think one of the patterns that we see is that it happens increasingly frequently in conflicts in the Middle East. We've seen 100 journalists kidnapped in Syria. There used to sort of be, people used to not talk about those numbers, and certainly in individual cases, there are often circumstances where you might not write about or talk about an individual case as people are trying to resolve the situation. But there's been more willingness to discuss discussed those numbers, and they're very high.
And have you seen any kind of pattern with your journalists?
Well, we haven't had too much of a pattern of kidnappings, fortunately, but there is one dynamic with kidnapping that's always important to think about, and that's that when a journalist is kidnapped, how much publicity do you want to do around it? It can depend. Sometimes you want to tell the whole world to make clear to captors that this is a real journalist, that this is not some spy or military person, that they're a real journalist and they have a family and they work for a legitimate organization. At other times, the less said the better. If you are in a position to negotiate with the person holding them, there may be a danger to giving them the sense that they're holding this famous journalist. Could tend to drive up the value to them of holding that person. So this is a difficult and tortured decision that news organizations sometimes have to make.
And does CPJ provide guidance for that? What journalists should do in that? How much publicity you should give it if your journalist is seized? I mean, I'm thinking of the journalists who were ultimately beheaded.
We frequently talk with the news organizations involved. We ourselves have to grapple with that decision as well, whether or not to publicize a case or whether or not we think it's in the journalist's best interest to not publicize or draw attention to the case. And that depends on a lot of local context and circumstances, and those decisions are made obviously in consultation with the family, with the media organization. So it's hard to have a single rule of thumb because it's so dependent on the situation.
And in addition to the physical dangers to journalists, there's also the online dangers, dangers in the cyber world. So,
yeah, very substantial. Your cell phone can be your friend, or it can be an enormous danger. It can work as a tracking device for people to know where you are. If seized, it can show your whole network of contacts. You go on to something that says free public Wi-Fi. Yeah, sure. Free public Wi-Fi, and find that everything you're doing is being keylogged, including all your passwords. So it's something you have to think about all the time. The question comes up sometimes, what kind of communication is really secure for a journalist? And I would say none. I really can't think of any way that an ordinary journalist would be able to guarantee that their communications are secure. Even if you protect your phone and you protect your computer with passwords and this and that, someone can demand that password. Mike Tyson is quoted as having said, "Everyone has a plan until you punch them in the face, then they don't have a plan anymore." So if they take you down to a basement and slam your head against the wall and say, "What's your password?" That's not a totally secure situation for your information.
But of course, journalists need to have electronic devices to do their work, right? Or are there situations where you think they should just go in with a pen and pad?
Well, there's probably something to be said for some situations in mailing your information home.
Are you serious?
Yeah, or putting a memory chip in your shoe might be better than using some fancy encryption that, in fact, that country is able to break. I'm not saying that necessarily everyone should mail stuff and put flash drives in their shoes, but I'm just trying to say that you have to judge what the capabilities are of the situation where you're operating, of the country that you're operating in. How essential is it that I maintain all this information? What can I keep in my head? What can I put in some form that's not completely obvious? It's you can have sort of security hubris where you fancy yourself an expert on encryption, but there are people who are more expert than you are.
And Alex, what kinds of surveillance have you seen of journalists or online, I guess, invasion?
I mean, it's something that we see frequently, although much less than it actually happens, because surveillance is sort of defined by being obscure, easily deniable, and hard to trace. But we see journalists get hacked in order for governments or other groups to preempt stories, to know what they're going to publish beforehand and take a counterline against it, and of course to find and identify sources.
Do you have some examples of that, the preemption and countering stories that haven't been published?
You know, I'm taking a lot of this from the Citizen Lab report that came out, I think, last year or the year before. We've seen, you know, in Ukraine, we saw the names and personal information of journalists published online. We've seen in Latin America, there was some network, and we don't know exactly what the nature of this network is, that was sort of hacking into journalist communications, possibly working on behalf of some governments. We saw Hacking Team Revelations, which is was an Italian sort of surveillance company or private technology company that sold its services to a number of governments, often governments that did not have good human rights records. And we saw that those tools were used to look at journalist communications in Ecuador, that other governments like Mexico also had access to that technology.
Have you seen, do you have examples from your reporters?
We've had that information that Alex referred to, personal tales about reporters in Ukraine. That includes some of our people. So yeah, you're always being watched in a cyber way, and people think that that their cell phones, if they use the lock on them, are so secure. But you know, there's lots of things about cell phones. A lot of people will name their cell phone with their own name, you know, Sandy's cell phone or something like that, or their initials, and they wind up walking around broadcasting. You know, anyone can look at what wireless networks are there and see their phone broadcasting. They're transmitting their location at all times. Or people will switch to airplane mode on the theory that that takes them off the air. Well, it may not. It may freeze their keyboard, but it may not really take them off the air. The dangers of cell phones are substantial. They can be monitored and sometimes the data stolen from them, even if you're not using it. Just, you know, if it's sitting in your pocket. Some reporters buy Faraday bags, which are little bags that block all radio transmissions, and put their phones in those bags, and then say, well, you know, to their colleagues, I'm gonna take my phone out of my bag and be on the air for 1 hour a day, and the rest of the time it goes back in the bag. I mean, obviously you can try all these techniques, but you're never really secure. During the hour it's out of the bag, who knows what'll happen.
I think that's an important point. That's not to say you shouldn't try to mitigate risk, and I think there are a number of important steps that you can take. Encrypted communications, strong passwords, updating your devices, having devices that are secure and are much more difficult to hack. You know, all of those are extremely important steps. You know, I think one thing that is very important to us is we can't really expect journalists to be these super security experts.
And they're not.
And they're not. So what you need technologies, security to be so built into technology and so widespread in its use that journalists don't stick out when they're using encrypted communications, that's what everybody is using, and that's the natural and easiest thing to do, and that's what their sources are doing. So that's, you know, there have been some movements there. We see more end-to-end encryption and a variety of services. It's much easier now to communicate via encrypted chat on your phone. Obviously, that doesn't help you if somebody takes your phone, puts a gun to your head, and says, "What's your password?" But there's been some progress. I think the key thing is realizing that nothing is absolute and nothing's 100% secure. And one thing that you have to ask is this story worth it? And can I adequately protect my sources in order to go forward with this story? That's something one of our former IPFA awardees, Oscar Martinez, who's a reporter in El Salvador, he talked about that in terms of physical threats to sources. So if you show up, you fly in as a journalist to a neighborhood in El Salvador and want to talk to one of the gangs there, and you show up with a police escort and you talk to a source and then you leave, that source, all of the neighbors, everybody around that in that neighborhood has seen police, a journalist talking with that person, and they want to know what they said, and they may find that out and through very violent means, and you leave, but you leave that source in danger. And the question he always asks is it worth it? And I think that is a question you have to ask for physical threats, but also for digital threats when you're talking about your sources.
Let's talk a little bit about encryption, even with the caveat that it may not really be secure. What are some methods and software or apps that journalists can use to try to protect their information?
Well, there's Signal, which is open source. There's Silent Circle, which costs some money. A lot of the chat apps like WhatsApp are supposedly very secure. Of course, everyone thought Tor was really secure until it wasn't. But these are some of the things that are probably fairly safe unless someone gets into your phone or unless it's a determined adversary who wants to devote the computer power to trying to crack it in your case.
Are there any that CPJ, I don't want to say recommend necessarily, but are there some that
we use Signal. We have serious concerns about the security of Telegram. We tend to use Signal, and frequently we'll use WhatsApp as well. It uses the same encryption sort of software as Signal, and is fairly secure, and it's it has very widespread use, so it's often easier to contact a source initially through WhatsApp, which is incredibly valuable because then your initial contact is through an encrypted channel. Then we also recommend having sort of phones that are harder to break because, as you said, if they can get into your phone, it doesn't really matter what end-to-end encryption you're using. So certainly the more recent iPhones tend to be fairly secure, and more secure than many Android phones, although you can go into different makes and models. So I think that's generally what we would recommend.
The National Press Foundation recently did a webinar with a journalist about different encryption tactics, and we'll have that in our resources section to go along with this video. What should a journalist do if you know you're under surveillance or your phone is being tapped?
Well, I suppose the thing to do is not to contact sensitive sources because you'll lead those surveilling you right to them. To continue to be as objective as you can, make clear to anyone watching that you are an honest journalist, you're trying to cover the story fairly. I think that it's important not to try to counter surveillance. Most of the time, or much of the time, the people surveying you are professionals. And if you try to evade their surveillance, you will look like you're a spy. I mean, not a very good one, because I'll probably be better than you are, but you will put a cloud of clandestinity around yourself, which will make you look like a target more worth following. And avoid, silly things like telling a source, if I tell you to meet me Wednesday at 4, that means Thursday at 5. Professionals who are surveilling you will figure that out very quickly. and it just adds to the sense that you are some kind of secret agent or would-be secret agent.
And if your phone is being tapped, and you either assume it's being tapped or you discover that it's being tapped, are there any alternatives, any options? New phone?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think that's one option. But I think if your phone is being tapped, there's a good assumption that there might be an actor that would attempt to, surveil a new phone that you acquired. So I think it's very important then to, like Tom said, think about whether or not you can safely contact sensitive sources, and then you might, depending on whether it's safe to reach out to resources while you're under surveillance, I think you might want to reach out to different resources that could help you investigate what's happening, and identify those threats a little bit more.
But I guess going to the police isn't necessarily the answer, because the police might be the bad actors.
Sometimes, although we also see surveillance coming from non-state actors, criminal organizations, cartels, groups that, sort of mercenary groups that surveil people and then charge money for the information that they gather. So it's frequently the state, but certainly not always.
There have also been some journalists over time who've tried to play some kind of a game with people listening in to them, sometimes after a drink or two. They'll blow a whistle into the phone, oh boy, I bet that really got him, or they'll make, taunting comments about those listening in. That's not good policy. It can end very badly. And surveillance is a serious thing and needs to be taken very seriously.
And what do you do if you're in a situation where police or bad actors demand your cell phone or your camera or other equipment? I mean, do you have standing guidance, Tom, for your reporters?
Again, that's a very personal decision. I don't think we would ever say that reporters should risk their lives for any reason. So if someone with overwhelming force or potential for overwhelming force demands something, it's really hard to resist. I mean, if you're operating in some country with a rule of law, you can demand a lawyer. You can, and it helps sometimes. I mean, some countries even have a shred of rule of law that you can appeal to, and that might at least bring some delay or sometimes even succeed. But faced with absolute force, there's not much you can really do.
Mm-hmm. And do you see a lot of that, Alex? I mean, just, the journalist is left behind, but they grab their equipment and take advantage of it.
Sure, absolutely. We see that all the time. We see that all over the world, including in the United States. We saw a lot of equipment seizures around, combined with arrests in Standing Rock. And so it does depend. If there's rule of law, you can get a lawyer to come, try to make sure that police don't access any of the videotape or material without a search warrant, or if you can have lawyers help fight the search warrant. Even if rule of law is sort of less stable, sometimes just drawing attention to the fact that, hey, my cameras, my memory cards are still with the police, and trying to get those back can be effective, but it can be very difficult. One of our partners at Freedom of the Press Foundation have been sort of pushing camera companies to encrypt cameras. So there may also be technological solutions, although we're not there yet.
And what do you do if you are arrested or jailed?
It depends on the country, but you appeal to whatever rule of law there may be. If we're talking about being arrested by some kind of government person, you demand a lawyer. You appeal to their professionalism in the hope that it exists to some degree. Presumably, if the country's a dangerous one, you have been in communication with people so they know that you're missing. They may, even if you're using an app that shows your location, for example, people may be able to determine exactly where you were when you went off the grid. So, there's that. And then, if the detention goes on, then publicity can be a very important factor.
Does CPJ have guidance on that? I mean, is what to do if you're arrested? I mean, do you have resources for journalists to contact, or if they don't have ready access to a lawyer?
Yeah, I think journalists can contact CPJ.
If they're able to communicate.
If they're able to communicate,
Yeah.
or family members can reach out to CPJ, which can help connect them to resources on the ground, help sort of identify local lawyers. But again, I think it's sort of situation dependent. Frequently, one of the best things to do is make a fuss, sort of draw a lot of public attention to the case, because there still is a stigma, fortunately, against jailing journalists. But there are some countries where that is less effective.
And is there, since you guys collect statistics, is there an average duration of, how long a journalist might be held? I hope, Tom, that the case of your journalist in Turkmenistan who's been held for 3 years is an outlier.
We don't actually, or I don't have off the top of my head statistics about that. We frequently see very brief detentions, so journalists might get picked up at a protest, or might be jailed for a couple days. But if they're convicted, and especially if they're convicted under these more frequent anti-state charges, those can be incredibly long sentences.
Anecdotally, Tom, anything about your reporters?
We've had people pulled in for 6 hours, and as you say, up to 3 years. It's tremendously variable.
Let's talk about censorship, which is another challenge for journalists reporting. What types of examples have you seen of that?
Well, there's less censorship these days of the kind that used to exist. Back when journalists had to use telephones and telegraph stations and things like that to transmit their dispatches, where you gave your dispatch to somebody and they'd cross things out with a blue crayon. There's less of that. Most censorship these days is after the fact, retaliation for what you've written. But there's also a lot of attempt to censor your audience's access to you, blocking your site, ours, for example, on the web in some countries, or still some radio jamming, just like in the old days. So I think this is censorship in a way that's directed not against the reporter, but at the audience, and the audience needs to find ways around it.
And how do you overcome that?
Well, there's several things. Most commonly, getting around censorship of sites on the web, that is, say, sites that are blocked. There are several tools. There are proxies that people can download, like the Siphon proxy, that will enable you sometimes to get around a blockage. There's some browsers like Opera Mini that have circumvention capabilities. Sometimes you can reach a site on Opera Mini that you can't with other sites, with other browsers. There's a variety of things that you can do. VPNs, for example, can sometimes get you through. And audiences are quite inventive these days. A lot of people really consider that they have a right to the internet, and they react very badly toward their governments trying to tell them what they can see on the internet and what they can't. And they find ways around the blocks.
Yeah. And what are you seeing, Alex, at CPJ?
One interesting thing that we've seen recently is at least 3 sites were recently blocked in Venezuela. They were covering some of the protests against the Maduro administration. And we saw a number of other digital outlets start picking up their content. So when their sites were blocked, they got 7 or 8 other sites to stream all of their content, to air all of their content. So the message still got out, and it was sort of that level of solidarity. It can be incredibly important.
Let's talk a little bit about the psychological impact on journalists of being in these hostile situations for months or years at a time. Tom, what do you see with your reporters?
Well, one problem is being months or years at a time in these situations. It's probably important for journalists as much as possible to vary their professional life so they're not always in these traumatic situations. There is the danger of post-traumatic stress syndrome, obviously, from the horrible things that you see, and that has effects on journalists just as it can on soldiers and on civilians. Then also the journalists can make sometimes choices in the field that they suffer from. They suffer not from necessarily from the horrors they see, but they suffer from their own choices. Mm-hmm. If you go back to some of the things I was talking about earlier, for example, am I going to help this injured soldier or not? Am I going to distribute food to the hungry rather than just write my story? Sometimes afterward, you can't live with yourself because you think you made the wrong decision. And I would say that when you face situations like this, you need to think, what can I live with personally? And even if your own organization says, this is how we want you to act in a situation like this, you have to say, well, can I do this? Can I work for this organization? Am I really an advocate rather than an objective journalist? Mm-hmm. Maybe you should then be an advocate, be an activist. But you want to think, will I be able to live with this a year from now?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Alex?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to sort of think out ahead of time some of the situations that you're going to be in. And I think planning that out and thinking about it beforehand can be very important. It's been good to see more news organizations, more security training courses start thinking about this element of what is the psychological impact, or what is the long-term psychological impact. We see it with reporters who are on the ground covering conflicts, but we also see it with reporters that might be a little bit outside of the conflict zone but are still seeing incredible amounts of harm. So reporters in Greece who are covering the refugee crisis and seeing so much death and suffering from that, I think have also been very affected. And again, I would just point out that local journalists also suffer these consequences, and it can be a very different dynamic for them because they may not have the shock of being in a conflict zone and then sort of going back to normal life, which is something that you hear about. But they stay in that conflict zone, and I think that can have a pretty huge impact.
Are there organizations that offer resources for journalists who have suffered this kind of trauma, other than their own employer?
Yeah, I think there are a number of networks for freelance journalists that offer some resources for those who can't get resources from their own employers.
Can you name a couple?
I know Frontline Freelance Registry might be an organization. I don't know exactly what resources each individual organization offers in terms of mental health services, but I know it's an increasing focus. I know it's something that CPJ is looking at, and I know that there's sort of increasing efforts in sort of all emergency programs to connect people to start connecting with local mental health resources and start connecting journalists to those. So we'll sometimes take cases and also help connect journalists to those resources. There's
also a problem sometimes with journalists taking advantage of these resources. At times journalists are very macho and they say, oh, I don't need any help. I'm a big man, I'm a big girl, I can handle this, and they don't get help. It's not a bad idea if you're an editor or a supervisor in a journalism organization to say, look, anybody who goes into this kind of situation, who covers this kind of story, is going to mandatorily go and get some counseling afterward. And if the counselor decides you're fine, then so be it. But you're going to have a conversation with somebody, and then that, for someone who really would like a little help but doesn't want to admit it, it's great relief to say, okay, well now I have to go and talk to this counselor.
The editor made me do it.
Yeah, exactly. The editor made me do it because sometimes they're afraid, well, if the editor finds out I'm going to a counselor, I'll never get a good assignment anymore. I mean, this is, getting counseling is not a sign of weakness or a sin. It's a sign of wisdom and knowledge about yourself. And we just can't let a culture be created where this is viewed as some kind of failing that he needed to get counseling. We all need counseling after certain kinds of things.
That's an excellent point to wrap this up on. So today we've learned how to cope in a hostile environment and strategies for mitigating risk. Our thanks to Tom Kent, President of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and Alex Ellerbeck, Senior Research Associate at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Resources from this webinar will be posted for your use on NPF's website at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better.